I was drafted in 1943. We went to Indian Town Gap. It was inducted out there. A train load of us left Connellsville and went. That's where we went. And then we were dispersed to different sections of the country on different. We were all in the Air Force, so that made it nice for a lot of the fellows that we graduated from high school with. We were all in the same outfit most of the time, and then they started splitting us up and sending us to different places to school. But there's still a few of us stayed together, and we didn't know what outfit we were going with though. But we had to go to Fort Wayne, Indiana, and then from there to Laurinburg-Maxton Air Force Base. That's where the troop carrier was making up their group at. And but before that, part of us shipped down to Florida for physical training school, and then came back to Fort Wayne, Indiana for another reassignment. And after that, then that's when we broke up again. And so I was about the last one to leave. Well, they sent us to Greeley, Colorado, Colorado State College. We took a course out there for 3 months on engineering and operations but they didn't tell us what it was for, but that was for the troop carrier. And then after we went back to Fort Wayne, Indiana, and they started shipping us out, we didn't know where we were going. But a lot of the other fellows had already shipped out, and I was about the last one to leave on this next train. And anyway, we were going down through the South, and they said, well, stopped at Laurinburg-Maxton Air Force. And they said, this is where you get off. And so I thought, oh boy, I think some of the fellows are there. So when I went into the office at Laurinburg-Maxton, I said, is this where Charlie Light's at? And he said, yeah, he's right back here in an office, in the chaplain's office. So I walked back and I seen Charlie. We graduated together, and I said, he said, you in here outfitting now too? And I said, yeah. He said, well, don't tell anybody at home I'm the chaplain's assistant. So I said, he's laughed. He said, well, the chaplain and they had been on a plane trip, went someplace, and on the way back, the lightning struck their plane, and they were all lost. They all got killed on that. So they had a new chaplain, and he needed an assistant. So Charlie was the last one coming in, and so he got the assistant job, but he didn't care for it. I was in engineering operations. I was assigned to that, and when I went into the engineering operation office, they said, well, you're the final one we were waiting for. They said, we have our major is in charge of the engineering office, the operations, and he said we have a master sergeant, and then we have a tech sergeant and a staff sergeant, 5 bucks sergeants, and you're the last one to come in, so you're a corporal. So I said, why can't I be sergeant? They said, that's just all that they allow for. That's their organization. So he said, you'll have to be a sergeant, be a corporal. I said, all right, that's all right. But we all did about the same type of work, and just took our turns on that. We had to keep track of all the planes and all the squadrons, and when they would leave, we'd have to put them on the board and make sure that whenever they came back that we had to report on them and took them off of the board, that everything was all right. And that was what our job was in the engineering and operation part of it. I was on the ground off it. I didn't have any flying as a part of it, and I was just as glad afterwards when I found out that they used those C-47 planes as the ones they were planning on using taking the paratroopers in and dropping them. And there's no guns on those planes. They're just a transport plane. And all they have is fighter cover over top, escorting them on the further when they go for the missions. And so that's why I had admired them, but I sure wouldn't want to have been a pilot flying those ships. It so happened that there was about 5 or 6 of us from Connellsville in the same outfit when we shipped overseas from Camp Shanks, New York. That's where they went up for our embarkation, and it was an air echelon that went. They went through the Azores and over through the Pacific on the way over to England, and then we were on a going by ship, the ground echelon, and so we heard it was on the USS Calvin Coolidge, and everybody said, "Oh, that sounds like a presidential liner." And I said, "Yeah, I'll bet." And we got on. It was one of them troop ships that they built for just taking troops. They just named them after presidents, and so we laughed about it. But it was a rough trip going over, but we made it all right. And then we were we were stationed at this Greenham Commons in England was the base there, and it was just like the town, but they had the airport was all took over the town, and the runways and everything ran through the town, so the Germans couldn't find out where the airports were over there in England. So that's the way that we were there the whole time, and waiting for the invasion to take place, but nobody knew when it would be or anything. And then they moved the paratroopers in, and they put up tents, and I had some pictures there that show you the tent area that they had for the paratroopers. And about every other day, they would load and get them to pack up with all their gear, take them out and load them on the planes, and they'd sit there for hours waiting. And then they'd say, "Well, you may as well get off. This was a dry run. This was not it." They wouldn't tell them when it was. And finally, the night before it happened, I happened to be in the engineering operations, and I was on duty that night. And we always had one fellow at night, just in the and so our commanding officer, Captain Colonel Donaldson, he came over to the engineering operation, and he knocked on the door, and I asked him who was there, and he said, "Colonel Donaldson's." I opened, I figured, well, this is the commanding officer of the base. I opened the door, he said, "I want you to take me out to the 87th Squadron dispersal area." And I said, "Sir, I'm not supposed to leave here. I'm by myself." And he said, "Well, I order you to take me out to this area." I said, "All right, sir, I locked the door and got in the Jeep and took him out to the 87th area. And as soon as when they pulled up there, boy, the guards hollered, 'Halt!' He said, 'Who goes there?' I told him, I said, 'What's the password?' I said, 'What's the password, Colonel?' He said, 'I don't know.' He said, take me back to the wing, take me over to the wing, and I'll get the pass." So I took him over to wing headquarters, and they gave him the password, and I took him back and dropped him off. So he was flying the weather ship to see how the weather was going to be that next day or that night. And anyway, I brought him back to where he wanted to go, and I went back. I told the guys the next day, they said, "Well, you weren't supposed to leave her." I said, "Well, he was the colonel. He's the colonel of the base, and he told me to take him. I had to do it." So anyway, they laughed about it, but that never happened again for me. But that they kept doing that, and they had done a lot. Did a lot of flying there out of there every day and then they were towing gliders and training on towing gliders, because after they had to drop, they was going to drop equipment and more paratroopers on gliders, and so they've been working on that. And so they do that every day, and then they'd make some other runs that they had to make around in England. But we were in a pretty nice place there, but still, you'd see these, they had all these barrage balloons with the cables down around close to the coast to keep the Germans from shooting these V-2 rockets over there and trying to blow parts up. Well, they hit those balloons and they'd go off before they did any damage in England. Oh, one day, the bombers, B-17s would be going over there all day. You'd just hear them heading for Germany, bombing them, softening it up, getting ready for an invasion. And then one trip, some B-17s flew over our base heading back home, and two of them came together and they blew up and crashed right there, and some of them parts came down to some of the tents. I think they said it killed some of the paratroopers because the parts coming down there were in their tent area. But that was the only bad part we had there about that. And but every night, every time you hear them sirens go off, those bombs they were shooting from Germany would be coming over, but they didn't seem to do much damage in England. We didn't hit our area. But you knew that they were shooting those rockets over there. But in England, they fought it pretty good. I'll tell you, the English people put up with it. But they put us up in. They built these Nissen huts, round-headed, shaped dome huts, and that's what we lived in England. And some of us lived in a chateau that they had over there. It was taking over a big home. They were nice, nice quarters. We liked them. Had a big garden in the back, beautiful gardens. And just General Eisenhower was the one that persuaded them to go into Normandy. They were figuring on going another place, and he told me they're figuring on the Germans are figuring we're going to do there because it's the closest across the English Channel. It was only, I think, 20-some miles across the thinnest, narrowest part of the island, of the channel, and they thought that's where they'd hit. But here they went down towards Cherbourg and Normandy, and that's where the drop was. So anyway, when they decided on that, well, that was we didn't know it was going to happen either until they were loading the paratroopers on. It was the middle of the night, and it was about 4 minutes before midnight or something. And Eisenhower come on the base, and he went through talked to all those paratroopers on the planes. He walked through all and got on and told them that Godspeed and that he hoped good luck and to make it a good success, would be a successful drop. So that's whenever, and they always appreciated him coming through and talking to them. And then when they left, the planes took off at 4 minutes after midnight, headed for Normandy, and we had four squadrons on our base: the 87th, 88th, 89th, and 90th of the 438th, and then there was the 439th troop group and 3 or 4 other, I don't know what the numbers were, on other parts of England. But they had a setup where they all would rendezvous at a certain place over the channel. They all coming from a different area. Ended up there were 72 planes there, all loaded with paratroopers, and they all came heading in just almost in the same direction, but on an angle. And they come over the drop zone about the right time. So that's the way it went. And when they got over the drop zone, the pilots would throw the light on and the green light on, and the paratroopers would jump out with this. The first plane we had on was the colonel of the base. He was the pilot of the first plane. The rest of them all followed. And they were the ones in each squadron, the head of the squadrons. They were all captains and colonels, some of them lieutenant colonels, and then the rest of the squadron were just lieutenants and captains, some of the pilots. But and they'd follow their leader of their squadron. Colonel Donaldson's plane was the first one, and the fellas behind said, well, they seen the anti-aircraft come out from ground fire, hit one of the planes and hit the tail section, and they said they seen the fire coming out of the tail section. One of the other planes said, but that plane got over the drop zone and he was still on fire, but he pulled the green light and the paratroopers got out, and he made his turn and come back, and he lost his rear rudder, but he still made it back to the base. So that was the only plane that got damaged on the first 72 planes that went over. And Eisenhower come back and told him later on after the mission, he said that everything was a success. It was a great drop. And but the groups behind them, some of the English paratroopers were coming on another angle, and they lost some. They had lost a few planes, but we didn't lose a plane on that first drop. And then the next day, they right in the morning, I guess they notified our base that they wanted our air echelon to go down to southern France the next morning and start driving paratroopers on drops going up from southern France, so they'd come in from another angle and dropping paratroopers. So they did that. Well, on the second drop that they had, second day that they took paratroopers up, one of our planes got hit, and it caught on fire, and they crashed. And one of the boys from Connellsville was on the plane, Lester Strickler. He was in our high school class, too. We knew him. And one of the other boys from Connellsville was a parachute rigger in one of the other squadrons, Larry Lujak. He used to work at the Troutman's building right next to this when it was in its heyday for that time. And then Charlie Light, and there was, I forget who some of the other ones were. But Charlie and I were in headquarters, and Lester Strickler and Larry Lujak, they were in different squadrons, but Larry was a parachute rigger. And anyway, after that plane crashed, and Lester got burnt and got his leg broke, and they sent him back to the States. And here in a couple of weeks here, we got another boy from Connellsville came in, and those fellows, they said they couldn't understand that. They haven't seen anybody from the room state yet. We had 6 fellows from Connellsville in the same outfit, and they laughed. But Harold Fraser was the one that they shipped in that came in and joined us over there then. But that was one of the unusual situations there. But we had they had a good drop for Normandy, but they said it was terrible seeing those landing crafts going, and their job was to drop them behind the lines and come in and knock those bunkers that were up on the cliffs, shooting at those men that were in the landing crafts, just getting on shore. And that's where they lost so many men from the Navy, from the ground forces, the ground ships landing there. And so then whenever they went and finished their drops up from southern France, then they came back and started towing gliders from England over with resupplies and resupplying gasoline for Patton and resupply other food and stuff for the troops and ammunition and that. And they'd come with these gliders and drop the gliders, and then even bring some paratroopers on the gliders too. And but the one bad part about the gliders were they were just made out of plywood. And there was something that one day that one of the operations officer in headquarters where we were working, they had a man, and one fellow was in charge of the planes. The other fellow was the glider operations officer working out of our office. And he asked us one day, "You fellas want to take a ride in the glider?" And they come up and said, "Yeah, we'll take a ride and see what it's like." So he took us up in the glider, and man, when they cut us off, you couldn't hear no motors or nothing. And we said, "Don't get too far from the base, man, so you can land and get us back all right." So anyway, we did. Whenever they landed, it sounded like the thing was going to come up to pieces, and that plywood, but they held together and they did the job. But boy, it was something to see them planes towing them big gliders off. The tow rope that they used, nylon tow rope, was about 3 inches in diameter, and they had that and stuff. So it was laid along the highway, along the runway, attached to the plane, and the plane would take off slow enough to get them started, and then they'd get started, they'd pull them right off the ground and fly them over. But the bad part was whenever over in England, you couldn't tell what the weather would be. You'd fly, you'd take off, and it'd be sun be shining, and you'd get 10 miles away and it'd be so foggy you couldn't see. So that was the only trouble with towing the gliders. The glider pilot couldn't see the power pilot in the plane pulling him, and the plane couldn't see the glider either, and if it started pulling on the plane, one of them would have to cut off, and if the plane cut off first, those ropes were so heavy that they just took the glider down, and there wasn't much hope for the villain unless he cut them off real fast and could glide the glider down. But the Germans were smart enough that all the fields they had that were any size, they put telegraph poles all through those fields so that the gliders, if they would try to land there, they'd just all crash up. And they lost a lot of them that way. And a lot of fellows were killed, and glider pilots, we lost quite a few of them. But all the drops were pretty good. They said that they were successful except the garden market basket, the one going up into Holland, and it was the worst battle, the worst drop they ever had. They lost a lot of planes. Our outfit lost planes and crews. If we'd lose a plane off the board, then we'd know whose the pilot was, and then we would know the name of the pilot that they record of the plane that was lost or was shot down, and we'd put that on the board too. But we didn't know them personally because they were in their own squadrons and they kept with their own men. And but the Strickler boy, I knew him, and when they came back and we seen his plane, I said, "Well, Lester's won't be coming back." And they said, "Well, he's sent back to the States." We heard a lot more stories after we'd come back from the war, and we started having our reunions, and the fellas there. Then you got to know the fellas, and they told some of the stories that they on their trips that when they were flying, the conditions, some of the things that happened to them, and the fellas said they didn't believe it. Some of the stuff, and they got back or they got shot down and had to work to get with the paratroopers, and they'd help to get them to a place where they'd be picked up and brought back to England. So it was all worked out. We were in France. After the invasion and after they got a hold over there, then we were shipped to Reims, France, and we were put up in tents over there. And boy, it was cold, snowing, and that was the worst part. It was cold in the mornings, and we'd take turns in our tents. Take turns. The fellow that started the fire, a pot-belly stove, and he'd set his cot right close to it where he had it all kindled the night before, where he could put a match to it and get it hot before anybody got out of their sleeping bags. But boy, it was really cold over there. But that's where our outfit was over there then, so we had a set up in England and in Reims and around Paris is where we were building it over there. And then that's from where we left from there. Whenever they said we were coming back to the States, and we thought, they were sending us over to the Pacific to help. That war wasn't over yet, and we thought, we'll be going over there. But on the way home, then they said the war was ending over there, so we went right back to Fort Wayne to Indiantown Gap. It was a good trip home. It was better than when you were going over because they were worrying about submarines. They had a lot of subs following us the whole way over, and they were trying to make sure that they had warships following and coming along beside us, protecting us going over. And they said that they seen subs in the area, so that's what they were trying to take a decoy away from the troop ships. But we didn't have any trouble going over, or coming back. Either way, coming back was all right because the war was over then. On the ship, they said that the war had ended in the Pacific, so we wouldn't be going over there. And I thought, oh boy, we're heading for now, we'll get out. So that's what we did. We got to Indiantown Gap, and they said, you fellows were scheduled to go to the Pacific, but that war has ended also. So that was a good message for us. got our discharge, but they wanted to know whether you wanted to sign up for the reserves. They said, no, we just want to go home. We didn't want to. We think about it. They said, well, you could sign up and then have them still be in the service. And I said, no, I'm ready to go home. So that's where we ended up coming back to. We came back by ship to the only ones that came back by air were the air echelon of the group, that they brought the planes back, what they had left. And one of the planes, for one of the squadrons, it took out to Dayton Air Force Base, and we went out there during one of our reunions. We had it at Dayton, Ohio, and we went to the Air Force Base. Here they had the one plane from the one squadron, the plane and everything the way that was when it was flown over there, and it was hanging up from the ceiling I think the 89 Squadron planes. But right before they had the invasion, it was about the day before or something, they came by and they painted 2 white lines about 2-inch wide around the tail sections of all the planes to show, designating which squadrons, which the 438th group, and then the other, they painted some other color on the other squadron, but the 438th had the white stripes painted around them, and that's the plane they had hanging from the ceiling out at Dayton Air Force Base, and it was there for a long time. We went out one time, it was after we came home, a bunch of us went out to see it, and it was still hanging there, and they said, that's one of the ones from our group. So our group when we had the reunion at Dayton, our group planted a tree and had a monument erected, which I have a picture of the monument in my stuff there, and the tree that we planted, and it had a real nice thing on this headstone for the old group and men that were lost and everything. It was real nice. It had a real nice service out there, and that was the main part of my. And we had one fellow in the squadron, one of the commanders of one of the squadrons. I think it was the 88th or anything, I'm not sure. And his name I can't quite remember. I think it was Bankert, or I think I have a book there but he was the only one that they knew of. He kept a log of every trip they went on D-Day and every mission after that. He always had a log of what happened. And while we were having our reunions here, he compiled that whole book and of all his, just like a diary. And we all got a copy of it. I have a copy with me here. And there was one book writer that read it, and he said, man, he said, I want to sit down with you and here's some other story. I think you left a lot out of that. So he did, and he ended up, the two of them, they produced that book, and I've brought a copy of that book, In the Rain of Fire. And I asked my daughter about getting it, and she kept looking. Finally, last Christmas, she said, I found it in the second edition. I finally located it, and she sent me a copy of it for Christmas. And it's really the book of the 438th. It tells you everything that happened, and all the troubles they had, and one planes that got hit, and it tells about that operating market basket, and the Battle of the Bulge, and the Ardennes Forest, and we were through all those affairs. We got a presidential citation with 7 battle stars on it, clusters on the pin. Some of the fellows that came home with me, they had other jobs. They went to where they were working, and I went back to my job and got my job back at Anchor Hawking Glass, and I ended up learning my trade as a tool and die man, and that's where I ended up and retired from. But it looks like we all had our jobs, and we didn't see really a whole lot of the actual war, because we weren't flying. but we knew what went on over there, and there wasn't much said about it around here. But then after we gotten with having the reunions and the fellows all getting there and hearing the stories, why, in fact, they kept the Colonel Donaldson was led the invasion, or right after the invasion. Then he got either he was relieved or got furloughed or something, got retired. But they sent in another commander, a base commander from West Point, and he was he had a fellas falling out for drills and all that stuff, and they didn't like him at all. They didn't have nothing to do with that current base commander. And anyway, the one we had on D-Day, and he was back in the States, he was from down in North Carolina or South Carolina. But every reunion we have, he never come, and everybody said, well, invite our commanding officer to come. And they said, we asked him, but he didn't want to come. Anyway, finally, towards one of our last reunions, we were getting less and less men, and they said, well, invite everybody, call the colonel and invite. So everybody did. Well, the colonel finally came to that reunion, and we always had a banquet, so they had him speak at that banquet, and he said, well, he didn't think the fellows hadn't, cared much for him, and they said, they all wanted him to come back. We liked him. He was good. He was an older fellow, but he was a nice fellow. And he said, well, I'll tell you some things that happened maybe you didn't know about on that first drop. He said the plane, his first plane, he led the invasion, the first ship. And he said when they're in parachute, when they turn the green light on, they have a clip they hit on the cable, and all they do is jump. They hook that clip on there and jump. So he said one fellow came by and he missed the cable, and he slid to the back of the plane. He got knocked out, and he said, so he didn't get the jump. And whenever he came to, he said he wanted to jump out, and they said, well, you can't jump. We're on our way back home. He said, you can jump tomorrow when we'll be taking more. He said, I want to be with my own troop fellows, he said, and he was great. But he said that happened. He said, a lot of you didn't know that. He said, but so stuff like that you don't hear until you get sitting around with a bunch of the fellas, and they had some good stories. But that book that he wrote with his diary and that Into the Rim of Fire, if you ever get a chance to buy that book, buy it, because it's just all about the 438th Troop Car.